My mother hadn't said a word to me in 9 years. Not at my wedding, not at the birth of either of my children, not once. Then on a Tuesday afternoon in April, she showed up on my porch with a folder of paperwork and two demands before she even said hello. "I need your signature," she said, "and I need you not to ask why it took this long to knock." I want to tell you I shut the door. I didn't. I stood there in my socks with a dish towel still in my hand, looking at a woman I used to know so well I could finish her sentences before she started them, and I realized I couldn't anymore. Grief does something particular to a face. So does nerve. My mother had both, and she had never once in her life needed anything from me. To understand why that had changed, you have to know how it started. I grew up the middle of 3 children in a family that measured love in appearances. The right pew on Sunday, the right university, the right kind of man, standing beside you in the family photo at Millbrook Farm, the horse property outside Richmond that had belonged to my father's people since 1954, and that my mother, Margaret Bennett, treated like a 4th child, better fed than the rest of us most years. I was 26 when I brought Daniel Cole home for Sunday dinner. He was a structural engineer, the kind of man who remembered the name of every waiter and the waiter's kid's name too. My father, Thomas, asked him real questions about a pedestrian bridge. He was finishing outside Roanoke and actually listened to the answers. My mother excused herself before dessert and didn't come back down. 2 weeks later, she called to make her position official. "This isn't about him," she said, in the tone people use right before it becomes entirely about him. "It's about what this family has built, what people will assume. Say what you actually mean, Mom. I mean, I raised you for a different life than this." I told her Daniel and I were getting married in June at a small vineyard 40 minutes from my apartment, and that I hoped she'd walk me down the aisle. There was a pause so long I thought the call had dropped. "If you marry that man," she said, "don't expect anyone from this family to be standing at the end of it." I got married in June. Nobody from Millbrook Farm came. My father sent a card 2 weeks later with a check tucked inside and no note at all, which was somehow the loudest silence of the whole ordeal. Proof that he'd thought about it, and proof that thinking wasn't the same as showing up. For 9 years, that was the shape of things. My brother Ryan mailed a Christmas card the first year, then stopped, worn down, I think, by how much easier quiet was than picking a side every holiday. My sister Megan moved to Phoenix for work and existed to me mostly as a name in group texts I was never added to. My father never called, not once. But every March and every October, Nora's birthday, then Theo's, an envelope showed up with no return address, postmarked Richmond, holding a savings bond and nothing else. No note, no name. I never told Daniel who I suspected it was from. Some hopes feel safer left in a drawer where disappointment can't reach them. We built a good life without Millbrook Farm's blessing. Daniel became the kind of engineer younger colleagues specifically asked to be assigned to. I taught art to 6th graders and fell in love with the particular chaos of a room that smelled like temper paint and rubber cement. Nora grew into a fierce, funny kid who narrated her own life like a nature documentary. Theo turned 3 and developed a serious professional interest in dinosaurs and string cheese. Our first Thanksgiving as a family of 4, I stood at the stove stirring gravy and caught myself listening for a knock that was never going to come. Daniel noticed. The way he always noticed. He turned up the radio and pulled me into a slow, ridiculous kitchen dance until Nora demanded to be included too. That became its own tradition after that. Not a fix for the empty chair, just something sturdy enough to build around it. The closest we came to needing them was the November Theo spiked a fever that wouldn't break, and we spent 11 hours in a pediatric ER, not yet knowing it was just a bad virus, doing its worst before it broke on its own. I remember standing in that hallway at 2 a.m, watching Daniel hold our son and sing to him under his breath and thinking, somewhere in Richmond, this baby has a grandmother who doesn't know his middle name. I didn't call her. I didn't know yet if I ever would. Which brings us back to the porch. I let my mother in because it was cold, and because some reflexes outlast the reasons for them. She sat at my kitchen table, the one Daniel built with his own hands the summer Theo was born, and for a moment she just looked around the room, at the crayon drawings taped to the fridge, like she was reading a language she used to speak and had let herself forget. Then she told me my father had died in February. A heart attack. Fast, in his sleep. The funeral had already happened months ago. I had a father for 35 years, and I found out he was gone 5 months late, from the same woman who'd kept us apart the entire time. You didn't call me? It wasn't a question. I didn't think you'd come, she said, and I didn't think I could stand there and watch you not. That wasn't your decision to make. No, she said quietly. It wasn't. She opened the folder. Inside were estate documents from a Richmond law firm, tabbed and highlighted like she'd read them 100 times looking for a way around what they said. Millbrook Farm needed to be sold. My father, it turned out, had quietly remortgaged the property years earlier, trying to keep the boarding stable from going under. And between that and a decade of medical bills from his failing heart, my mother was 3 months from losing the land outright to the bank, instead of selling it on anyone's terms at all. The trust required signatures from all 3 of my father's children. Ryan hadn't spoken to her since the funeral, a fact she delivered flatly, like a weather report. Megan was being difficult about it, which I suppose she learned somewhere, my mother said without a trace of irony. That left me. So you need me, I said, for the first time in 9 years, because my name happens to be on a piece of paper next to yours. Something in her face cracked, slightly, at the edge, in a way I hadn't seen since I was a kid. Watching her lose an argument she still refused to concede out loud. I need you, she said, because your father made certain of it. He changed the trust the year you got married. Made it so no one could ever cut you out completely. Not the bank, not circumstance, not even me. I didn't learn that until the lawyer read the will to me in February. I've been sitting with it for 5 months, and I still don't fully know what to do with it. I didn't know what to do with it either. My father, who'd said nothing the night I was disowned, who'd stood somewhere in the background of that phone call, not stopping her, that same man had walked into an attorney's office and made sure his daughter could never be erased from a family he'd been too afraid to defend her in. There's a letter, my mother said, before I could ask. He left one with the firm, addressed to you. The instructions say it's only to be handed over in person, whenever you next came to Richmond. I haven't read it. I don't intend to. I flew out 3 days later alone. Daniel drove me to the airport and didn't try to talk me out of going or into it. He just squeezed my hand at the curb and said, whatever's in that letter, you get to decide what it means. Not her, not even him. I've loved that man for a lot of specific reasons over 11 years. And that sentence, at that curb, is one I'll keep for the rest of my life. The letter was 4 pages of my father's cramped engineer's handwriting, and I read it twice in the law firm's parking lot before I trusted myself to drive. He wrote that he'd been the one sending the bonds every year, that he kept a folder in his desk drawer with Nora's and Theo's ages written down so he wouldn't lose track of who they were becoming. That last spring, he told my mother he had a conference in Denver, and instead, he'd sat in the back row of Nora's kindergarten grandparents' day, 3 seats from a woman he'd never met, and watched his granddaughter explain with enormous authority how a volcano works. He wrote that he cried the entire drive to the airport afterward. He wrote that he'd started keeping a jar of loose change on his desk labeled in his own private handwriting for when I'm brave enough to fly out uninvited, and that he added to it every week and never once let himself spend it. Near the end, he wrote that he'd spent 35 years being a careful man, and that carefulness had cost him almost everything that mattered, and that he was sorry it took dying for him to say so where anyone could actually hear it. I sat in that parking lot for a long time. I wasn't angry anymore, exactly. I was just sad, in a way that had room for everyone in it. For him, for the version of me that used to check the mailbox every October and pretend I wasn't hoping, and even a little, for my mother, who had no idea her husband had an entire kindergarten year memorized that he'd been too afraid to claim out loud. I told her about the letter that night at her kitchen table, this time in the house I grew up in. She was quiet for a long while before she said the truest thing she'd said to me in 9 years. "My mother disowned me too," she said. "Not for the reason you'd guess. Your grandfather James was a machinist, not a Bennett, not anyone she considered anyone. She didn't speak to me for 4 years, not until you were born. I swore the entire time that I would never become her." She looked down at her hands, older hands than the ones I remembered gripping a phone 9 years ago. And then I did. I told myself the reasons were different enough not to count. I'm not asking you to tell me they were the same, because they weren't. And I know it. I'm only telling you where it came from. You deserve to know it didn't come out of nothing, even though nothing about that makes it right. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. It was something more useful than one, an explanation, offered without any expectation that it would erase anything. I signed the papers 2 days later, not because she'd earned it. I was careful with myself about that distinction the entire flight home, but because my father had asked me to, in his own roundabout, 35 years too late way, and because I was tired of letting other people's fear decide the shape of my own family. I told my mother the signature came with a condition. If she wanted anything more from me than paperwork, she would meet Daniel properly, at my table, in my home, and she would learn her grandchildren's names before she used them. She came in June, almost exactly 9 years to the week after the wedding she'd refused to attend. Daniel opened the door. I watched my mother look up at the man she'd once called a mistake she wouldn't let me make twice, and say quietly, "Thank you for letting me into your home." He stepped back and told her dinner was almost ready, and that Theo had made her a place card out of a dinosaur sticker and would take it personally if she sat anywhere else. She sat in the right chair. She cried twice during dinner and blamed the candles both times, and nobody corrected her. It isn't a fixed thing, not that night and not in the year since. Some Sundays she still says something that makes my jaw tighten, some old reflex about appearances that therapy hasn't fully sanded down in either of us. But she knows Nora's volcano facts by heart now. She calls Theo by his actual name, first try, every single time. And I've stopped checking the mailbox every October because there's a woman who shows up in person these days, imperfectly, on purpose, which turned out to be worth more than any unsigned envelope ever was.